So Chorus, it's a space shooter with some open world bits where you play as Nora, who used to be a member of a cult called the Circle, who use their cool spaceships with powers from another dimension to bring peace and safety to humanity, by force. Though Nora starts to doubt if this is the best way to do things, as after getting an order from the leader of the cult to kill a planet with only a few billion people on it, against her better judgment she goes ahead and does it by opening a massive rift in space that looks like it leads to the Upside Down. Though she instantly regrets doing it and tries to close the rift with some allies, though they fail. Badly. Feeling guilty after wiping out an entire planet, she ditches the cult and her cool sentient ship called Forza and goes into hiding for 7 years. The game picks up after all that, where you play as Nora, who takes on missions to help a small outpost who are trying to survive outside the influence of the cult. And you can pretty much guess where that's going to lead.
Good. Commander Storm, execute the revision doctrine.
You begin with a bit of a junk ship, which you can upgrade with some new parts, but the real fun starts once you get Nora's ship back, Forza. This is when the gameplay starts to get good, as this ship has a lot more options when taking on enemies, like cool powers and getting new gear that change significantly how you fight, which makes you feel like a bit of a badass once you get the hang of it.
Affirmative. Strike doctrine.
It's only really let down when it tries to force you to fly and fight in narrow areas, and is maybe missing a few common space shooter features, but I'll get into that later. Though the main thing holding the game back is the story. It isn't bad, and it has stuff in it I like, though the story doesn't do the best job of establishing a setting and is a little drawn out and vague at times. Also maybe a little too much stream of consciousness.
That took too long. My weapons aren't cut out for this.
Okay.
Especially with the main character Nora's inner monologues, which is a lot of whisper talking. It reminds me of David Lynch's Dune movie.
Space.
But before I get into that, how does the game run? No big problems here, just minor ones. For instance, I did have a bit of a choppy frame rate in cutscenes, but increasing the frame rate limit to max seems to fix that. And there was this one side mission near the beginning of the game that I couldn't start, but it turns out I needed to progress the story a little to be able to activate it. Like, this game does have some Metroidvania elements where you need a skill to access a mission or area, but this mission was just to shoot some pirates, so not sure what was going on there. Oh, and the last little problem was, during random combat encounters in the open world, Nora and Forza will say you finished off the last of the enemy, though sometimes there will still be some left.
Perimeter clear.
So this is what pulled out.
Not major problems, but noticeable. But let's get into something the game does fairly well. The visuals are very atmospheric, which I'm not talking about figuratively but literally, as a lot of the game has pockets of gas or particles to help set the tone for areas. Like at the start when you're exploring a derelict ship, which feels a little claustrophobic because of how thick and muddy the air looks. And once you're out in open space, the lack of any atmosphere feels lighter and freer, though you'll still see some interesting looking clouds of gas lingering around, with bits of particles around and wind effects to give a nice sense of speed. Though not so sure how there's wind in space, but I'm not going to worry about it too much, or we might awaken those nerds who like to argue about sound in space. It feels like something they'd be annoyed about. Anyway, the effects work pretty well with a great looking backdrop showing off stars, planets, rings, and big rocks. There are times where it can look a bit average, but others where it can make a really nice desktop background, especially the ice field section of the game. The use of color and effects is also nice, mostly subtle and a bit vibrant when it wants to be, but still explosive in combat. It mostly nails the space sci-fi vibes with the ships, with the stand-up being Nora's ship Forza, which gives off a very sleek predatory bird feel. Nora's design is also pretty cool, with a face tattoo that a certain traitor Primarch might approve of. The game's music and sounds aren't too bad either, with the main theme being a standout. It's combining a lot of different elements together, like the orchestral instruments mixed with what I can only describe as Dawn of Civilization singing. And there's even some synth thrown in there too. It's pretty unique and sounds great. The rest of the tracks fit fairly well into the game and did a good job of highlighting moments when they needed to. Other sound effects like weapons, thrusters, and ambient sounds are also all solid. The voice acting, however, I'm a bit mixed on. The main cast is doing an okay job, but the extras I'm not so sure about.
And here I thought it was my lucky day, but I guess it's yours.
Sure. I would just sell it anyways. Good luck out there.
Same to you. Bye.
I don't know why, but I find the way this one character awkwardly says bye really funny for some reason. But back to the main cast. There is a lot of talking in this game, with the main characters chatting about nearly everything that's happening. And don't get me wrong, some of it is interesting.
What exactly do you remember?
That my rights were critical to opening the rift.
What about the Prophet?
I felt his presence, but there was something else.
But I don't need to know all of Nora's inner thoughts. Some is fine, but the game does the mind whispering thing a little too much.
There's some sensitive cargo we'd better find first.
Understood.
We're looking for weapons. Well, duh.
Another thing that annoyed me was the game limits you to only 7 save slots, and the autosaves can be a little far apart at times. Not sure why the game limits saving so much, as I do sometimes like to go back and play cool set pieces or combat encounters in games instead of playing a whole big section of the game again. The save system doesn't really allow for that, like it would have been nice to even have a chapter selector or something, but no, nothing like that. Also, another thing the game is missing for me is like a Codex or lore tab in the menu, so you can refresh or learn things you might have missed in the story. Like a lot of the way the game presents its lore and stories is with these memories Nora can find while exploring the map. Which is fine, but can be a bit disjointed if you're not quite sure what they relate to. And it's not like you can listen to them again for reference. But let's get onto some stuff the game does a better job with. The game controls well enough with it giving you the option on PC to play with either keyboard or mouse or a controller. Though I found it more comfortable to play with a controller. It feels pretty good to fly around open space at high speed using the drift ability and other movement powers that let you do some fun maneuvers in combat. The game, however, is missing some things I would expect to see in a space sim game, like the ability to lock onto targets or being able to reverse your ship, but it does mostly fine without these, surprisingly. Though I would have liked the lock-on feature in some cases just to keep track of targets better. But with the fast movement and how quick you take out most enemies, you'll eventually get them all. The weapons do have a tiny bit of auto-aim once you get an enemy in your sights, but not so much that it feels too easy. The variety of weapons is also pretty good, with each class weapon doing better in certain situations, so switching between them will usually be more effective than sticking to just one. Like lasers tend to take out shields faster, while missiles do better against armored targets, and Gatling guns are great for shredding unprotected holes. You'll also get to pick different versions of these that have their own quirks, like lower or higher rates of fire, or charge shot, or cluster missiles, etc. Combined with the different powers you get called rights, you can have a lot of fun in combat. You'll unlock these new rights as you progress through the story. Some of these will change the combat significantly, like the ability to teleport behind enemies, and one later in the game where you can spear through enemies with your ship. Some of these powers can be upgraded with useful bonuses as you make progress, though at the start of the game you won't be able to spam these powers constantly, as you'll need to wait for your rights energy to charge up.
Power. Pure energy. Growing my inner strength.
To increase your rights energy, you'll collect energy fragments from closing rifts, which will spawn on occasion as you fly around the different maps. But there are ways to overcharge your rights energy by using certain abilities, or equipping the right power mods, as a set loadout with your weapons will give bonuses for you to do that. And these set bonuses can do more than just give you extra energy, as they can give you more damage for your weapons, or make it so your weapons don't overheat, or even leech shield power from enemies if you get close enough. This is great and all, but the weapons and mods have set stats in them, so while you can use them for a while, especially if you like the current loadout with the bonus it gives, eventually you're going to need to change them out for weapons or mods with better stats to keep up with the enemies you'll face later in the game. And while I think it's good that the game keeps you trying new things, I would have liked the ability to level up sets of weapons. Or maybe the game should have kept the stats separate from the weapons and mods themselves. It would have made them more viable to use later in the game. The way the game is set up now, it has these cool builds, but you can only use them for what feels like a limited time, which is a shame as the combat in the game is pretty good otherwise. Like for me, there were points I was starting to feel overpowered, but then the game would introduce a new enemy or mechanic that I needed to adjust my tactics to. Like the dodge, where you need to do a roll to avoid a powerful enemy shot, or needing to take out enemies from above or below instead of just from behind. It kept the gameplay fun for most of my playthrough, even if it did get a bit repetitious with a lot of the small side jobs in the open world maps getting repeated fairly often, such as taking out circle or faceless enemies, and the very dull ones being where you roleplay as roadside assistants, by refueling stranded ships or playing tech support for civilian vessels who've had their computers hacked by scammers or something. All you'll be doing in these is floating in space and pushing a button and doing nothing else, and getting extra credits for it. At least you can use the credits to buy hull or shield upgrades, I guess. There are much better side quests that actually have some stories that feed into the main one and that have better rewards like mods and weapons. But I guess they needed those little side jobs to fill the map with stuff to do. Speaking of which, the exploration of maps is done mostly okay, with you being able to find extra credits floating around and maybe even mods, if you go out of your way looking for them. The maps do also encourage you to revisit them in a Metroidvania way, with new powers letting you get into places you couldn't before. It's done well enough that I wasn't annoyed going back to areas, but I wasn't very excited to either. There was something I wasn't able to get a complete handle on while playing the game though, which was the parts where you fly in confined spaces. And I'm a little hesitant to critique the game on it, because maybe I was just garbage at these parts, but I was always bumping into stuff when doing these sections and they never felt good as flying in open space. Like, I kinda get they were going for maybe a bit of a trench run sort of feel with these sections, where you fly fast in tight spaces, but it hardly ever felt good to me. But again, it could just be my lack of skill with these parts. Let's get back to stuff I had less of a struggle with. The few set pieces in the game where you have these biggish battles with lots of enemy fighters and large capital ships are done pretty well. I enjoyed these as you have a lot of things you need to deal with, which keeps it interesting as you go through the battles. From taking out weak spots on big enemy ships to helping defend allies when they call for help, and taking out enemies that are harassing you. Another thing I liked are these mini boss fights against ships that later become more common enemies, which is a nice way to introduce you to the mechanics they add to a fight. There's even the odd occasion where you'll fight against fighters who have powers similar to Nara. Those are all good. The boss fights I didn't dig as much were the ones against the faceless enemies like the Sentinels, which is like a floating space tower thing with revolving parts that have weak spots on it that you need to maneuver around to hit. They're not so bad to fight in open space, though if you fight in an enclosed area while trying to avoid their beams and attempting to get a shot off on their weak spot, it can be really annoying. Also, the big boss faceless enemy is like a worse version of this, as it's much bigger with more beams and these damaging pillars of light being thrown at you while trying to hit these awkwardly rotating weak spots. And on top of that, for portions of the fight you'll need to fly in narrow tunnels at speed to hit a hidden weak spot, and you already know how I feel about flying in tunnels in this game. It's not that the fight is particularly hard, though it is a bit tricky. It just felt long and drawn out at times and I got no satisfaction in beating it. But apart from all that, the combat is good overall, and for me the game is at its best when you're fighting in open space against multiple enemies, as it feels like the controls and types of abilities you get during the game tend to favour that, and not so much the fighting in tunnels. Maybe playing Descent would be better for that. So what about the story? The story is a bit difficult to talk about. There is stuff I enjoyed like the sci-fi setting, cool space powers, and a character trying to redeem themselves, but the story as a whole never gripped me. And I'm not so sure if it's the way the story is told, which as I mentioned before relies a lot on you being interested in looking at all those floating memories in space, to get some context for a lot of the things happening in the story. That they only really explain much later, when it might have helped to be a little less vague at the start, like the faces and how they are connected to people getting their space powers, or how the Seekers are related to the Circle cult. Establishing these things at the start of the game might have helped with better understanding what Nora is doing and why. And it's not like the story is incomprehensible or something, it's just very scattered, if that makes sense. Like, I think I get the general themes of the story being redemption, with Nora looking to redeem herself after joining an oppressive cult and wiping out an entire planet, then running away from all that, and years later starting to help people while coming to terms with what she did and trying to become a better person, while also mending her relationship with Forcer, her ship who she treated like a tool before leaving the Circle. Even though Forcer is actually a sentient being that was forced into being a ship spirit computer thing. It all sounds like it would make an interesting story, with Nora needing to confront her past and fight back against the cult she used to be a part of. They even link her getting her powers back to her character growth in the story. Like when she goes into these space temple places dotted across the map to, I think, mentally confront parts of herself to get her right powers back. But there's never any tension in the story, it kinda just goes from one story beat to the next, where you know Nora is going to be successful whatever she's going to do. It's not all bad. There were some cool bits like how Nora and Forcer reconcile over the course of the game and become partners instead of Nora just using him. Also, some of the side stories are interesting, like one where Nora helps a pirate faction with its internal power struggle, and later they come help in another mission. Or one where you need to destroy these werewolf weapons which are considered really dangerous, and you get a bit of a choice if you want to use them. Though this side story does lose its bite a bit when the weapons are just a bit better than your current loadout and get replaced quickly by new gear you get that have higher stats. Kinda undercuts how dangerous these weapons are supposed to be. Also, there are some story choices you can make as you go through the game, but these aren't that meaningful from what I can tell. They have very little impact on the main story. It feels like a feature that was either downsized a lot during development and this is what's left of it, or maybe it was just added at the last minute. In either case, it isn't really helping the game, as you'll feel like these choices don't really matter that much in the story. Like, maybe they do, but if I can't tell, then it's not really working now, is it? So the main bits of the story is going to be Nora and Forcer going from system to system, fighting the Circle Cult and Faceless, while doing some side missions on the way and gaining allies. Until Nora finally confronts her big oopsie of opening a planet-killing rift with the friends she made along the way. The ending isn't too bad, but it's going to go how you think it will. They do try to do something interesting at the end, though I was a bit more confused than surprised. So this game is pretty solid gameplay wise, though there are some smaller parts that could have been done a bit better, such as the interesting weapon loadouts and bonuses being stuck behind stats, which means you can't use them later in the game. For me, that felt like it limited my choices in playstyle. The game does make up for that with combat that feels good and gives a fair number of abilities to play around with, and giving a good sense of progression through the whole game, with enemies that gave enough of a challenge to be fun to fight, most of the time. The story on the other hand, I wanted to like but just didn't get into it. It's not bad, but it's also not a story that's going to linger with me either. You might feel differently, and if you want to give the game a try, it does go on sale fairly often, and I think it's worth it if you're looking for some fun space sim combat. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did like it, then maybe consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, see you next time.
Bye.